In the summer of 2011, the Lakers were shockingly swept by the Mavericks, and with it, the aura of the Lakers, the defending back-to-back champs who started the season 8-0, was gone. A team ravaged by injuries and chemistry issues, a dysfunctional mess in what turned out to be Phil Jackson's final season as head coach. Kobe looked like a different player by the postseason. Normally he raises his play in the playoffs, but the injuries he sustained in 2010 further hampered his play in 2011, and by the time the playoffs began, it was seen as a big deal when Kobe could even dunk. That's how bad it was. And outside of Andrew Bynum, who was rarely healthy, the rest of the Lakers core were all in their 30s. The Lakers needed to go young and not waste the rest of Kobe's prime. The front office responded by acquiring Chris Paul from the Hornets. Oh, wait, that was vetoed. The consequence of that veto was a lost season, as Odom wanted out, Paul played like a man bothered by constant trade demands, Fisher eventually was shipped out for Ramon Sessions, who Laker fans, me included, saw as a savior because our point guard situation was that bad, and Kobe, after a strong start, began to break down the rest of the season. All this with new head coach Mike Brown, who was and still is a good coach. Bynum had by far his best season and was widely seen as the second best center in the league in a year where the center position was pretty underwhelming, to be honest with you. And then Artest, well, he became our world peace right before the season began, but while Artest was all about world peace, my only other memory of him this season was violently knocking the daylights out of James Harden back when he was still a likable player. That resulted in a 7-game suspension, which meant missing the first 6 playoff games in the first round against the Nuggets. Speaking of which, Kobe was great in that playoff. Not as great as he usually was in his prime, but he still had another few years of elite play in him. The Thunder got their revenge against the Lakers in the second round, but Kobe came out swinging in Game 5, scoring 42 points and being the only Lakers that showed up. No one knew it then, but that would be the last time we ever saw Kobe in the playoffs. Hey guys, Cyber TV here. You can call me Kevin. And while this video started out with the 2011-2012 Lakers, I wanted to first provide some backstory to how we got through 2013 Lakers and their blockbuster offseason. But first, like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and all of my social media accounts. It'll help the algorithm out. Anyway, during the 2012 offseason, the Lakers front office made a splash with the acquisition of future Hall of Fame point guard Steve Nash and future Hall of Fame center Dwight Howard, who at the time was widely regarded as the best center on the planet. On paper, this starting five was loaded. You had 4 future Hall of Famers, and 2 of them you could argue were 2 of the top 3-4 players in the entire league. You had veteran former All-Stars, the 5th starter, and world peace. The only starting 5 you could argue exceeded it was Miami, and that was mostly because they had some guy named LeBron. But even removing their best players in LeBron and Kobe, both starting 5s were pretty comparable. With those 2 additions, the finals were seemingly set in stone. We were finally going to see a Kobe vs. LeBron finals, until it became clear that we weren't. The Lakers entered the regular season going 0-8 in the preseason, which, it was just preseason. That's despite 7 of those games being at home. Sure, again, it was only preseason, and Dwight only played in 2 of those games while still recovering from back surgery, but that abysmal preseason set the tone for what ended up becoming a disastrous regular season. This was a season of lows, brutal lows, occasional highs, and a depressing end. A team that started 1-4, then 15-16, and then 17-25 before going on a seemingly miraculous 26-12 run that ended with Kobe tearing his Achilles and effectively ending his prime. What followed was 2 close wins to lock up the 7th seed and a brutal beatdown against the rival Spurs in the first round, a fitting end to a disastrous season. So how exactly did it get to that point? Well, I'm going to start out by saying that for all intents and purposes, this was a super team formation. I will not compare it at all to what Miami did a few years earlier, or what the Warriors did a few years later. This super team formation was more in line with what the Rockets did in the 1999 lockout season, and what the Lakers did in the 2003 offseason. It was also largely the work of the front office, and not the players themselves, which also separates it from what Miami and Golden State did in the 2010s. Had they all been in their mid-late 20s, it would be a different story, and there's no doubt in my mind that team with the 2013 Lakers at their peak would sweep the 2013 Heat, especially with the obvious size and skill advantage that the Lakers had. But unfortunately, this was not even close to that. The Lakers were very old for a pro basketball team. That was the first of many problems. Nash had a solid all-star caliber season in 2012 on a Suns team that barely missed the playoffs in a tough West, but at age 38, he was due for a career-altering injury and that's exactly what happened 2 games into the season versus the Trailblazers. Nash played only 16 minutes in that game before suffering a fracture in his left leg that would sideline him for nearly 2 months. For the season, Nash was only able to play in 50 out of a possible 82 games, and many of those 32 games that he missed came in what was probably the toughest stretch of the schedule for the Lakers, which is another thing that gets glossed over. The 2013 Lakers had a brutal first half schedule. In their first 41 games, they faced 25 teams with a .500 record or above, and 12 that won at least 50 games, 14 if you include a 49-win Nets team and a 49-31 Pacers team that had 1 game canceled. I believe that schedule contributed both to the Lakers' slow start and their strong second half play as the schedule became easier. But as mentioned earlier, Nash was out for most of this early first half schedule, and he was far from the only injured player. Paul also missed extended time. He played in just 49 games, and like Nash, he missed many games during the toughest stretch of the regular season. In the 33 games Paul missed, the Lakers faced 18 teams with a .500 record or greater, and 9 of which were against teams that won at least 49 games. In the games where neither Nash or Paul played, the Lakers went 3-5 and played 7 of those 8 games on the road, facing teams like the Rockets, the Thunder, and the Knicks, all of whom won at least 45 games. For most of the season, one of Paul or Nash was out, and when the Lakers needed them both the most in that long road stretch, neither were healthy enough to help an already depleted Lakers squad. Even the bench rotation could not stay healthy, as Steve Blake missed 37 games, Earl Clark missed 33 games, Darius Morris missed 34 games, and Chris Duhon missed 36 games. These guys were supposed to be Nash and Paul's primary backups, but wound up missing about as many games, and often the same games those two missed. This meant that the 2013 Lakers often had 3rd or 4th string caliber guards and bigs surrounding Kobe, Dwight, and Artest, who were the only players besides Jody Meeks and 36-year-old Antoine Jameson that played at least 59 games. Unfortunately, even the players that were healthy enough to play most of the season were not anywhere near 100%. Artest was 33 and was no longer in his prime at that point. Kobe was still in his prime, but at the tail end, and Dwight, as mentioned earlier, was coming off back surgery and lost the legendary explosiveness that allowed him to terrorize the league in his Magic days. He was still an elite player. He was arguably the best center in the league, but that was a very weak year for centers, and he still wasn't playing at the level many expected. I won't blame him too much for that, as the injury was out of his control, but what I will blame Dwight for was his insistence on running the offense through him posting up. In those days, people were still obsessed with the post-up game and still believed that Dwight needed one before we could mention his name with the game's greatest bigs. But the reality is that the game was starting to move away from that, and Dwight was more lethal as a finisher in the pick and roll. With one of the greatest scorers and one of the greatest pick and roll passers in league history alongside him, there was no reason for him to believe that there was a better offense strategy for the Lakers. But coming off years as the focal point of the Magic and entering what was supposed to be his best years, Dwight understandably thought he should have continued being the focal point for the Lakers. But the reality is that he should have embraced a different role, very suited towards his skill set, and had he done that, I believe the chemistry for this team would have improved, and the Lakers would have gotten much closer to their ceiling. So at this point, I've concluded that injuries were the biggest issues with this team, and then to a lesser extent, chemistry issues. But what else went wrong for this team? The coaching. Mike Brown's a very good coach. I felt this way about him even at the time, but the Princeton offense wasn't the best offense to use, and really, I just felt that the firing was a little too hasty on the Lakers, and especially since the injuries were already beginning to pile on by then. But the Lakers brass fired him, and instead of hiring Phil like many fans had hoped they hired Mike D'Antoni instead. Now, D'Antoni is no doubt a revolutionary head coach, one whose fingerprints are all over today's offenses, for better or for worse, but I don't think he was the best choice for this team either. He never quite had a fair shake either, as Nash, who he famously coached during his days as the Suns head coach, was already out by then. But even with what he had, it could be argued that he misused Paul, just like Brown misused Paul before him. And it could be argued that the roster itself was never close to being optimized, even when Nash was back in the rotation. For this reason, I believe Phil would have been a better fit for the team. He would have better utilized Paul, would have been on better terms with Kobe, and would have installed a better defensive mindset that has often been lacking with D'Antoni coached squads. The front office dropped the ball on not hiring Phil, who wanted to return to coaching. I don't know if that would have been enough to mitigate the injuries, but perhaps Phil would have done a better job of handling Kobe's minutes down the stretch. And speaking of which, Kobe was great in 2013, especially offensively. Defensively, it was a tale of two halves, as Kobe's defense early on was often costly, especially off-ball, as he had this tendency of ball watching too much that got worse in his twilight years. But during that late season surge, he did pick up his defense, often locking up opposing stars in crunch time, such as Kyrie and Westbrook. But overall, I cannot say he was anywhere near all defensive this season like he was for most of his prime. But offensively, he was magnificent. Early in the season, Kobe was leading the league in scoring, and he was very efficient doing so. About 42 games into the season, Kobe was averaging about 29, 5, and 5 on 57 true shooting percentage. Insane numbers for that era when the offense didn't have the advantages that they have today. And it's worth noting that the 2013 Lakers was the closest that we've seen to prime Kobe playing in a modern offense. It's also worth noting that the Lakers were a plus 2.9 with him on the floor during this stretch, where the Lakers win a very disappointing 70-25, and in a time with no play-ins, it looked like a long shot for them to make the playoffs. Speaking of which,
the guy sitting next to me first.
Kobe.
Now, if that didn't work and I said something,
it's Charles Barkley.
The first thing is next is
you're not going to make the playoffs. he understands it now.
Hey, John.
And it's worth noting that the Lakers' schedule was tough up to this point, and that Kobe was often surrounded by injured players or third, fourth string caliber players starring alongside him. I believe that context is overlooked when discussing his season, and also believe that he was far from the problem of this team. But I might be wrong on that because according to Kobe, he was at fault for the bad start. You know, I often hear about Kobe being a bad leader, but I don't consider that bad leadership at all. Leadership always gets tested during times of crisis, and for Kobe to demonstrate that at that point of the season, and at that stage of his career, says a lot to me about his leadership ability. But Kobe wasn't just the type to talk, he walked as well. And perhaps no better example of that was demonstrated by Kobe than when he opted to become the team's starting point guard, starting with the game against the Utah Jazz. Kobe wound up scoring just 14 points on a very efficient 7-10 shooting, but he also had 14 assists and was a plus 15 in an 18-point blowout. In the next game against the Thunder, Kobe scored 21 points on a very efficient 8 for 12, and also contributed 9 rebounds and 14 assists in a near double-digit win. But when he needed to, he was still capable of going off. Who can forget Kobe's masterful back-to-back performance against the Hornets and the Raptors? Some of his best shot making in his career came in those two games, and of course, the amnesty that game. But anyway, for most of the rest of the season, Kobe manned the point, demonstrating that he was an excellent floor general when asked of it, averaging 25.1 points, 6.4 boards, and 7.5 assists on 57 true shooting percentage, which includes a game he barely played against the Pacers. The Lakers were rolling, but with the situation dire, Kobe was determined to give everything he had to put the Lakers back in the playoffs. A promise he ultimately fulfilled, but at a cost. When Kobe came back after missing basically 3 games near the end of the season, the Lakers were 36-33 and were the 8th seed by a respectable but not comfortable margin. In the next 11 games, he ended up averaging 29-6, 7.5 on 56 true shooting percentage. Great numbers no matter the context, but the insanity here is that he averaged a whopping 43 minutes per game. This stretch was no joke, as 6 of the 11 games were on the road, and 5 of the 11 opponents were at least .500, and the Lakers did go 7-4 in this span. I still remember watching the Portland game, and sure, it was against a team that basically started a bunch of rookies and gave up on winning at that point, but I remember Kobe having a stat line that I don't believe was ever achieved before, and probably hasn't been achieved since. 47 points, 8 boards, 5 assists, 3 steals, and 4 blocks. I still remember thinking to myself that Kobe had a few more years of superstar playing him. It only took 2 days for that to no longer be true. I will never forget that day, April 12, 2013, against a Warriors team that was about to make the postseason for the first time since 2007. A Warriors team that defined the next 10 years, but were at the time perceived similarly to the Kings last season. A North California team with a history of ineptitude and a loyal fan base finally making the playoffs. Going into this game, the Lakers were the 8th seed and had a 1-game lead over the 9th seed Jazz, who had the tiebreaker edge. It was a must-win game in order to reach the playoffs. The game was tied 57-57 at the half. Going into the fourth, the Warriors had a 5-point lead. Steph was magnificent in this game, scoring 47 points on 31 shots and only 4 3-throw attempts. But the story of this game were Kobe taking over in the fourth, scoring 12 of his 34 points in the fourth quarter, including 2 straight threes after the Lakers were down 107-101 midway through the fourth, and then this sequence where, down 2 points with about 3 minutes remaining and going against Harrison Barnes, Kobe drove to the basket and suffered the injury that ultimately ended his prime. His final act of the season was making 2 clutch free throws on basically one leg and a ton of adrenaline to tie the game up 109-109. The Lakers went on a 9-7 run in the final 3 minutes to win the game. The win put them in good position to make the playoffs, but it came at the cost of the franchise legend being out for the rest of the season. And the last 2 games to lock up a playoff spot were home games against the Rockets and Spurs. Good teams, especially the latter, but at that point neither team had anything to play for in the regular season. In fact, I guarantee you the Spurs wanted to make sure the Lakers made the playoffs because they knew they would destroy that team. Speaking of which, that's who they faced in the first round. And the Spurs did have something to play for in the playoffs, and they absolutely demolished the Lakers. The Spurs won by an average margin of 18.7 points. Objectively speaking, healthy Kobe likely wasn't going to do much to change the outcome, but Kobe had a fantastic track record against Duncan's Spurs, and that might have been enough. But unfortunately, I think injuries to other key players would have prevented an upset from happening anyway. A healthy Lakers team, however, could have potentially won this series, but we'll never know. So my final conclusion on the 2013 Lakers is that they were hyped up to be a team rivaling the greatest teams ever assembled, but due to both poor depth and injuries that came at the worst time, were unable to be anything more than a middle-of-the-pack team. Kobe had one of the best age 34 seasons ever, one of his best offensive seasons ever, and demonstrated both his underrated leadership and his underrated all-around versatility. I remember being frustrated with the rest of the team when he was leading the league in scoring. I remember the euphoria of Kobe dragging his team to the playoffs when so many counted him out. I don't remember counting him out even after the 17-25 start, but I do remember thinking the odds were against him. But I also remember thinking that if anyone could do it, it was Kobe. I still vividly remember after the 47-point game against the Blazers that he had more years in him, and sadly I still remember the shock when he had his Achilles tear against the Warriors. It was a roller coaster of a season for me, some highs, but a ton of brutal lows. It still does not sit right with me how that season went. So many things went wrong for them, and just when it looked like the unthinkable was going to happen, we witnessed Kobe essentially exit his prime with a career-altering injury. 10 years later, it's pretty obvious to me, and it should be obvious to everyone else, that the 2013 Lakers were simply not the team they were hyped up to be. Even if they were able to stay healthy, their depth would have been more exposed in the playoffs. And while I do believe Kobe had at least one more all-time great postseason run in him, I'm not sure if that would have been enough. If this team were formed just 2 years earlier, we would be having a different convo. Even then, the more time has passed, the more I have begun to appreciate Kobe's last great season. In real time, I appreciate it even with all the criticism I saw online, but nowadays I only really see people praise his 2013 season. Maybe because they realize just how incredible it is for a 34-year-old wing to drag a broken roster to the playoffs, primarily by revamping his style of play, in a tough West where the playing wasn't a thing. It was also close we saw Kobe in modern offense, and that team was still far from the kind of offenses we see nowadays, which makes me wonder what Kobe in the 2000s would have done in today's game. So I'll end this video with these questions. Were the 2013 Lakers a super team? How far would a healthy 2013 Lakers team have gone? Where does Kobe's 2013 season rank among his best seasons? Thanks to everyone that's made it this far. Leave a like and sub, and go check out all my social media accounts. Take care.